Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a really profound exploration, actually, a journey into the blueprint of life
It's
itself.
a huge topic.
It is. We're going to try and unravel this amazing story of how life on Earth came to be, how it keeps changing, and the mechanisms behind all that change. We'll be pulling in ideas from the thinkers who first started figuring this out, and also the modern researchers who are finding new stuff all the time.
It's a story that's constantly unfolding.
Exactly. And just to kind of grab your attention right away, here's something that might make you rethink.
Right.
Well, everything about where you came from. Did you know that you are, genetically speaking, cousins with a banana?
Huh. Yeah, they usually get a reaction.
Right. Or that every single living thing, bacteria, whales, us, everything shares a common ancestor. It sounds, I don't know, completely wild.
It does.
But today, we're going to unpack the evidence, the really compelling evidence that shows this astonishing truth.
Yeah, and it's one of the most profound things science has shown us. The reason we can say something like that, the banana cousin thing, it boils down to something fundamental.
Right.
It's this shared language of life, a universal genetic code.
A universal code.
Pretty much every living thing, plants, animals, fungi, microbes, they all use essentially the same molecular dictionary to store their information and build themselves. That shared language, that blueprint, it points directly to a single origin for all life we know.
Wow.
And this idea, the fact of evolution, it's as solid scientifically as, say, gravity or the Earth going around the sun. It's not just a guess. The evidence is overwhelming from so many different fields.
That shared code idea is just staggering. So our mission for this deep dive, then, is to explore those first big ideas that let us grasp this fact.
Starting with Darwin, of course.
Exactly. And then see how those ideas got refined, expanded, maybe even challenged a bit over time. And crucially, look at the modern evidence, the undeniable proof that we have now. We'll be drawing on Darwin, naturally, but also Richard Dawkins.
Shifting to the genes perspective.
Right. And then Jerry Coyne and Neil Shubin bringing in the fossils, the anatomy.
Tangible stuff?
Yeah, the tangible stuff. It's like a conversation across centuries, really, with everyone building on or sometimes arguing with what came before, but all heading towards this core truth.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning of this whole modern understanding with Charles Darwin. Before him, the common thinking was, what species just are fixed.
Yeah, pretty much. The idea was that species were created as they are, unchanging, immutable. But Darwin, through his travels on the Beagle and meticulous study back home, saw something different. He saw this constant struggle for existence.
The struggle for existence, that sounds quite dramatic, like lions hunting gazelles.
Well, yes, that's part of it, the obvious part maybe. But Darwin meant something broader, more pervasive. It's the constant competition for limited resources, food, water, light, space. It's surviving harsh conditions, heat, cold, drought. And it's just managing to live long enough to reproduce.
So it's not always direct combat. No, often it's not. Think about plants. An oak tree drops thousands of acorns, right? But only a tiny fraction ever become trees. Most get eaten, or don't find good soil, or get shaded out by other plants. That's the struggle. Every organism can potentially produce way more offspring than can possibly survive.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a numbers game, in a way. And Darwin pointed out that this struggle is often toughest between members of the same species. Why would that be? Wouldn't they cooperate?
Well, sometimes they do, but think about it. Individuals of the same species need the exact same things. They live in the same places, eat the same food, face the same predators and diseases. So they're in direct competition for identical resources.
Ah, right. Two squirrels after the same nuts.
Exactly. Or those oak seedlings you mentioned, side by side, fighting for the same patch of sunlight and water. Even a tiny advantage, slightly faster growth, slightly deeper roots, can make all the difference. Darwin saw this even with things like varieties of wheat sown together. The ones best suited to that specific soil and climate would just naturally produce more seeds and eventually crowd out the others. This internal competition is a really powerful filter.
And it's this constant filtering, this struggle that led him to his big idea, natural selection, the preservation of the good bits, basically.
Precisely. Natural selection, as Darwin put it, is the preservation of favorable individual differences and variations, and the destruction of those which are injurious. This is the engine behind survival of the fittest.
Which doesn't just mean the strongest, right?
Not necessarily, no.
Yeah.
It means the ones whose traits, maybe just slight variations that pop up naturally, make them better suited to their specific environment to survive and, crucially, reproduce more successfully than others. These useful variations get passed on, they accumulate over generations, and that leads to adaptation.
He compared it to how humans breed animals, didn't he? Artificial selection.
Yeah, that was a key analogy for him. Think of pigeon breeders. They can take a wild rock pigeon ancestor and, by selectively breeding birds with specific traits over generations, maybe certain colors or beak shapes, they create all these incredibly diverse domestic breeds.
Like fantails and powders.
Exactly. And interestingly, Darwin noted that if you crossed some of these very different domestic breeds, the offspring would sometimes surprisingly revert back to looking like the wild ancestor, the rock pigeon. Strong evidence they all came from that common stock.
And he felt nature's selection was way more powerful than human effort.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He said natural selection is immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts because human breeders have specific, often superficial goals, and they work over relatively short timescales. But nature, he said, is daily and hourly scrutinizing. Throughout the world, every variation, even the slightest, rejecting the bad, preserving the good, silently and insensibly working at the improvement of each organic being. It's relentless, working over vast geological timescales we can barely comprehend. We don't see it day to day, but over millennia, it shapes life profoundly.
It's a powerful image. Now, his ideas weren't instantly accepted, right? People push back. Like, how could selection explain things that seem unimportant, trivial traits?
Yes, that was a great difficulty, as he admitted. It's easy to see the benefit of sharp claws or good camouflage, but what about, say, the exact pattern on a butterfly's wing or some minor quirk? Darwin argued we're often ignorant about the whole economy of an organism. We don't always know what subtle advantage a seemingly minor trait might provide.
Like the giraffe's tail.
That was his example, yeah. It looks like just a fly swatter, maybe trivial. But he pointed out that in parts of Africa, the survival of cattle literally depends on resisting insect attacks. Constant harassment by flies weakens animals, makes them prone to disease, less able to feed or escape predators. So a seemingly trifling ability to effectively swat flies could actually provide a significant survival advantage over time, allowing those animals to thrive where others couldn't. It's about the cumulative effect.
Okay. And what about traits that seem purely decorative or even dangerous, like a peacock's massive tail? Surely that doesn't help it survive predators.
Right, and that led Darwin to another key concept, sexual selection. He realized not all traits are about simple survival. Many features, especially in males, gorgeous birds, colorful butterflies, even the songs of birds seem to have evolved because they're attractive to females.
So it's about mating success, not just staying alive.
Exactly. The males that were more beautiful or sang more complex songs were continually preferred by the females and thus passed on those traits. It suggests a kind of aesthetic sense, a preference for beauty and complexity that runs quite deep in the animal kingdom. It's a separate but equally powerful selective force.
And he also touched on where the variations come from in the first place. He noticed that changing conditions seem to increase variability.
Yes, variability is the raw material selection needs to work with. He saw that under domestication, where conditions change, organisms become more plastic, more variable. He reasoned that similar changes happen in nature too.
So the environment itself can sort of stir things up.
In a way, yes. The relationships in nature are incredibly complex, infinitely complex, he said. This means even a slight modification in one species could give it an edge over others. And because way more individuals are born than can survive, any individual with even a tiny advantage has a better chance of surviving and reproducing. Conversely, any harmful variation gets weeded out. So random variations happen, and the environment, through natural selection, picks the winners. Okay, so Darwin gives us this powerful framework of natural selection acting on individual organisms. Then fast forward about a century, and Richard Dawkins comes along with the selfish gene, and he flips the perspective. If Darwin showed what happened, Dawkins helps us understand how it works at a really fundamental gene level.
Right, the gene-centric view. That was a big shift. So what does he actually mean by a selfish gene? Is it like one specific bit of DNA acting selfishly? Because genes don't have intentions.
Exactly. That's the key point. It's not about conscious selfishness. It's a metaphor. The selfish gene isn't just one physical piece of DNA. It's all the copies, all the replicas of that particular gene, distributed across many individuals in a population. And its goal, metaphorically speaking, is simply to become more numerous in the gene pool.
How does it do that?
By programming the bodies, they reside in the survival machines, as Dawkins calls them, to survive and reproduce effectively. And here's the really crucial part of his argument. A gene can ensure its own propagation by helping replicas of itself that happen to be in other bodies.
Ah, so helping relatives who are likely to share the same genes.
Precisely. So what looks like individual altruism, an animal risking itself for its sibling or offspring, can actually be seen as the gene acting selfishly to help copies of itself survive and reproduce in those relatives. The organism becomes the vehicle for the genes.
That tackles the altruism paradox head on then, because it always seemed weird, from a pure survival of the fittest standpoint, why an individual would risk its own life for another.
It does seem weird if you only focus on the individual. But from the gene's perspective, it makes perfect sense under certain conditions. Think of J.B.S. Haldane's famous quip.
The one about saving his brothers?
Yeah. He supposedly said he wouldn't lay down his life for one brother, but he would for two brothers or eight cousins. Now, as Dawkins points out, animals don't do conscious calculations like that.
Of course not.
But natural selection has programmed them to behave as if they had. A gene that predisposes an individual to help close relatives who have a high probability of carrying the same gene is likely to increase in frequency in the gene pool compared to a gene that leads to purely selfish individual behavior in all circumstances. So gene selfishness can actually build altruistic behavior at the individual level.
Okay, that's a really powerful way to look at it. And this view even explains conflict within families, like between parents and offspring, or the battle of the sexes. That sounds quite cynical.
It can sound cynical, but it's really just looking at the underlying genetic interests dispassionately. Take a mother and her offspring. Genetically, she's equally related to all her children. Each carries half her genes. So her optimal strategy from her genes' point of view isn't to play favorites. It's to invest resources fairly equally across the largest number of offspring she can successfully raise to reproductive age.
Spreading the genetic bets.
Exactly. You don't want to invest too much in one spoiled brat if it means you can't raise others. But from an individual child's perspective, it's 100% related to itself, but only 50% related, on average, to its siblings. So its genetic interest is to try and get more than its fair share of parental resources, potentially at the expense of siblings. This creates an inherent underlying conflict.
A genetic tug of war.
Sort of, yeah. Parents are usually bigger and stronger. They control the resources. But offspring have ways to manipulate parents, too. Like, think about baby birds squawking loudly. It seems like just noise. But it's likely an honest signal of hunger. It's actually in the parent's interest to know who needs food most to distribute it efficiently. So the signaling behavior evolves. Even though it stems from the offspring's desire for more resources, it's a dynamic negotiation.
And the battle of the sexes, how does the gene's eye view explain the exploitation of the female sex that Dawkins talks about?
Yes, this is maybe one of the starker implications. It comes down to a fundamental biological asymmetry, the difference between eggs and sperm. Both parents, genetically speaking, want to maximize their number of surviving offspring while minimizing their own investment in each one, leaving resources free for other mating opportunities. But the female typically makes a much larger initial investment. Her egg is large, nutrient-rich, and costly to produce compared to the male's tiny, cheap sperm. So right from conception, she's more committed to that particular offspring. She stands to lose more if it dies.
Right, her initial investment is higher.
Exactly. This makes her more vulnerable to desertion by the male, who has invested less initially. If he leaves, he loses less than she does. This initial imbalance often leads to females investing more throughout gestation, lactation, and raising the young. So this pattern of female exploitation, as Dawkins terms it, isn't about conscious malevolence. It's an evolutionary consequence of the simple fact that eggs are bigger and more costly than sperm. It sets up an asymmetry in parental investment strategies right from the start.
It's a stark explanation. So, if genes are selfish, does this view allow for cooperation beyond close relatives, or is it always just about competition and exploitation?
No, it definitely allows for cooperation, and Dawkins uses game theory concepts to show how it can evolve. Think about strategies like grooming in monkeys. Imagine you have suckers who groom anyone, and cheats who accept grooming but never return the favor.
Okay.
If grooming provides a benefit, like removing parasites, that outweighs the cost, suckers do fine only with other suckers. But as soon as a cheat appears, they exploit the suckers. Cheats get groomed but pay no cost. So cheat genes spread and sucker genes die out. Indiscriminate altruism isn't stable.
So, nice guys finish last.
In that simple scenario, yes. But then consider a strategy like tit for tat. This strategy starts by cooperating, grooming, and continues to cooperate as long as the other individual does. But if the other individual cheats, doesn't reciprocate, tit for tat immediately retaliates by cheating back on the next turn. However, crucially, it's also forgiving if the other player starts cooperating again. Tit for tat will cooperate too.
Okay, so it's nice, but retaliatory and forgiving.
Exactly. And in computer simulations where different strategies competed against each other over many rounds, tit for tat consistently emerged as one of the most successful and stable strategies. It fosters reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, but with a penalty for cheating. This shows how cooperation, based on reciprocity, can evolve and thrive even in a world driven by selfish genes, because ultimately, stable cooperation benefits the long-term propagation of the genes involved.
Okay, so we've got Darwin's big picture of natural selection and Dawkins' gene-level explanation. But, for a lot of people, the question is still, where's the hard proof? The physical evidence. And that brings us to fossils. This is where we get tangible answers, right? Though I guess it comes with its own challenges, too, like those missing links people talk about.
Absolutely. Fossils are crucial. But yeah, the whole missing link idea often gets misunderstood. People imagine these bizarre chimeras like the infamous crocoduck, part crocodile, part duck.
Huh, yeah, I've heard that one.
It's a total straw man, of course. Evolution doesn't predict absurd mashups of modern animals. Monkeys didn't descend from frogs. Ducks didn't descend from crocodiles. What evolution does say is that these groups share common ancestors way back in time.
So the ancestor of a monkey and a frog wouldn't look like either.
Exactly. It might look more like some ancient fish-like amphibian, and we actually find fossils that fit that bill. The point is, we look for common ancestors that show a mix of traits seen in their descendant groups, not halfway points between modern species.
So the term missing link itself is maybe a bit unhelpful?
It can be because in any continuous evolutionary line, there's technically always a missing link between any 2 points you pick. Evolution predicts a smooth continuum, even if the fossil record only gives us snapshots. There must have been individuals right on the borderline between, say, Australopithecus and Homo. Finding more fossils just fills in more points on that continuum. It doesn't mean we expect to find every single transitional individual.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So instead of crocoducks, what are some real examples of transitional fossils that strongly support evolution?
Oh, there are tons of great examples. One of the earliest predictions, even back in the 19th century, based just on anatomy, was that mammals evolved from reptiles.
Right.
And bingo, the fossil record delivered. We have a fantastic series of fossils, often called mammal-like reptiles. Things like Dimetrodon, the famous sail-backed one, though it wasn't a dinosaur, and others like Thrinaxodon. Over millions of years, you can see the jaw bones changing, small bones moving from the jaw into the middle ear to become our hearing bones.
Wow.
The teeth becoming more specialized, the legs moving from sprawling out to the sides like a lizard to being positioned underneath the body like a mammal. It's a beautiful, gradual transition documented in stone.
That's incredible. What about birds from dinosaurs? That sounds even more dramatic.
It is dramatic, and the evidence is spectacular. The prediction was that birds evolved from a specific group of two-legged meat-eating dinosaurs called theropods, relatives of Velociraptor and T-Rex. And then we found Archaeopteryx.
The famous one.
The very famous one, yeah. Found way back in the 1860s. It's this perfect mosaic. It has feathers, clearly bird-like, arranged on its wings and tail. But it also has teeth in its beak, claws on its wings, and a long, bony, dinosaur-like tail. It's exactly the kind of intermediate you'd predict.
A snapshot of the transition.
Exactly. And since then, especially with amazing discoveries in China, we found loads of other dinosaur fossils, theropods, covered in various types of feathers, from simple downy fuzz to complex feathers potentially used for display or even gliding, long before true flight evolved. The connection is undeniable now.
Okay, that's compelling, but maybe the most mind-blowing one is whales evolving from land animals, going back to the water.
That's often cited as one of the best documented major transitions, yeah. It seems counterintuitive, but the fossil evidence is stunningly complete. The prediction was, if whales evolved from land mammals, we should find fossils showing intermediate stages, becoming progressively more aquatic.
And did we?
We absolutely did.
Good.
It starts with animals like Indohus, about 50 million years ago. Looked a bit like a small deer or raccoon, lived near water, but had distinctively whale-like inner ear bones. Then Pakicetus, still quite land animal-like, but with ears even better adapted for underwater hearing, likely hunting in shallow streams.
Okay, getting closer.
Then comes Ambulacetus, the walking whale. About 48 million years ago, larger, more crocodile-shaped, powerful tail, but still had functional legs ending in hooves, revealing its land mammal ancestry. It could walk awkwardly on land, probably like a seal, but was clearly spending most of its time in the water, swimming with its large hind feet.
Wow, a walking whale.
Yeah. And after that, things like Rhodocetus, even more aquatic, larger tail, smaller hind limbs, clearly used for swimming, not walking. You see the nostrils migrating towards the top of the head, becoming a blowhole. It's this beautiful sequence showing the step-by-step journey back to the water over millions of years. It's textbook evolution.
And Neil Shubin's discovery, Tiktaalik, that fits into this picture of major transitions too, right? Between fish and land animals.
Tiktaalik is a fantastic story, a prime example of predictive science. Scientists knew that the transition from fish to the first four-legged land animals, tetrapods, must have happened during a specific time window, the Late Devonian period, around 375, 380 million years ago. They also predicted these transitional forms would be found in freshwater sediments, not the deep ocean.
So they knew where and when to look.
Pretty much. Shubin and his colleagues, Ted Deschler and Ferris Jenkins, targeted exposed Devonian freshwater rocks on Ellesmere Island, way up in the Canadian Arctic. It was tough, remote work. And after several seasons, they found Tiktaalik.
And what was so special about it?
It was this amazing intermediate. Clearly a fish. It had scales, fins, gills, but it also had features of early land animals. A flattened head with eyes on top, suggesting it lived in shallow water, maybe looking up. It had a neck, allowing it to turn its head independently of its body, which fish can't really do. And the killer feature, its front fins. Inside those fins were bones corresponding to the one bone, two bones, lots of blobs digits pattern of all land vertebrates. It had a wrist.
A fish with a wrist.
Essentially, yes, a fin that could bend and support weight, allowing it to prop itself up in shallow water or maybe even make brief excursions onto mudflats. It was exactly the kind of creature predicted to exist at that time, bridging the gap between fish and the first tetrapods. A stunning confirmation.
Okay, these examples are powerful, but what about the gaps? People still point to the fossil record and say, well, groups seem to appear suddenly. Doesn't that contradict gradual evolution?
Darwin himself knew this was a potential objection. He acknowledged that some groups appear suddenly in the geological record, but he stressed how incredibly imperfect that record is. Think about it. Fossilization itself is a rare event. It requires specific conditions. Most dead organisms just decay or get eaten. Only a tiny fraction ever become fossils.
Right.
And then, those fossils have to survive geological processes for millions of years, burial, heat, pressure, erosion, and then they have to be exposed somewhere accessible, and then someone has to find them and recognize them. The odds are stacked against finding a complete record.
So it's like having only a few pages from a massive book.
Exactly. Darwin compared it to a history book, where only a few short chapters survive, and of those chapters, only a few lines on a few pages. There are vast intervals of time missing between the rock formations we do have. So a new group could have evolved gradually over a long period in a region where fossils just weren't preserved, and then later spread to an area where we do find fossils, making it look like a sudden appearance in that local record. The gaps are more often gaps in preservation or discovery, not necessarily gaps in evolution itself. And as we find more fossils, like Tiktaalik, we keep filling those gaps, right? So the fossils give us the historical snapshots. But evolution isn't just ancient history. It's written all over living things today, including us. It's in our anatomy, the way our bodies are built, and even in how we develop as embryos. These provide really powerful, independent lines of evidence.
So our own bodies hold clues to our evolutionary past, like shared blueprints. That's the idea of homologies, right?
Exactly. Homology is about similarities due to shared ancestry. Take the skeletons of mammals. A human arm, a bat's wing, a whale's flipper, a dog's front leg. They're used for totally different things. Flying, swimming, running, grasping.
Yeah, very different shapes.
Very different shapes on the outside, yes. Yeah. But look at the underlying bone structure. One bone in the upper part, humerus. Two bones in the lower part, radius and ulna. A set of wrist bones, carpals, and then finger bones, metacarpals and phalanges. That same fundamental pattern is there in all of them, just modified for different functions.
So the same basic parts list, just tweaked.
Precisely. It makes perfect sense if all mammals inherited that basic four-limb structure from a common ancestor, and then natural selection modified it in different ways for different lifestyles. It makes no sense if they were all designed independently from scratch. You see the same underlying unity across countless anatomical features.
And this happens even within a single animal, different parts being variations on a theme, serial homology.
Yes, exactly. Our own arms and legs are serially homologous, built on that same one bone, two bones digits plan. Or think about vertebrae. Our spine is a series of repeated segments, the vertebrae. which are similar but slightly modified along the length of the spine for different roles. Many scientists think even the bones of our skull evolved from modified, fused vertebrae-like segments early in vertebrate history.
Wow.
Or look at something like a lobster or a shrimp. They have all these different appendages, antennae, mouth parts, claws, walking legs, swimmerettes under the tail. They look incredibly different and do different jobs, but they are all variations derived from a basic segmented ancestral limb. It's like a Swiss Army knife, where one basic tool gets modified into many specialized ones. It's evolution, reusing, and repurposing existing parts.
Oh, okay, that's anatomy. What about embryology? How does the way we develop before birth reveal our history?
Embryology is fascinating because, in a way, development sometimes replays snippets of our evolutionary past. Not literally, we don't go through a distinct fish stage than a reptile stage, but we do develop structures that are remnants of our ancestors.
Like the famous gill slits. Do human embryos really have gills?
Well, not functional gills, no, but early human embryos, like all vertebrate embryos, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, develop a series of folds and grooves in the neck region called pharyngeal arches, sometimes called branchial arches. In fish, these arches develop into the jaw supports and the actual gill structures, with slits opening between them for breathing water.
Okay.
In human embryos, those same arches, those same developmental starting points get repurposed to form totally different things. Parts of our jaw, the tiny bones in our middle ear, muscles for chewing and facial expressions, parts of our larynx and thyroid gland. The slits usually close up. The fact that we start development with this fish-like architecture is profound evidence of our shared ancestry. It's a developmental detour reflecting our evolutionary history.
So our ear bones, you mentioned they came from jaw bones. That sounds amazing.
It is pretty amazing. It's one of the best examples. Take the stapes, one of the 3 tiny bones in our middle ear that transmits sound vibrations. Developmentally and based on fossil evidence, the stapes is homologous to a bone called the hyomandibula in fish.
Hyomandibula?
Yeah, in fish, the hyomandibula is a fairly large, rod-like bone that helps prop the jaw against the skull. It's part of the jaw structure, not hearing. But as vertebrates moved on to land, the function of this bone changed. In the lineage leading to mammals, it got smaller, detached from the jaw, and became incorporated into the ear to transmit sound. Same developmental origin from the second pharyngeal arch. Same nerve supply, but totally different function and shape. It's a direct link back to our fish ancestors, visible in how our ears develop.
That's mind-blowing. So beyond these shared structures, what about the quirks? The things that seem badly designed? Do they also tell an evolutionary story?
Oh, absolutely. These imperfections are some of the strongest evidence against perfect, independent creation and strongly support evolution as a historical process of tinkering and making do. The vertebrate eye is a classic example.
But the eye seems so perfect.
It works incredibly well, yes. But from an engineering perspective, it's case some oddities. The great scientist Hermann von Helmholtz famously pointed out its flaws, like the fact that the retina is essentially installed backward. The light-sensitive cells are at the back of the retina, and the nerve fibers and blood vessels that serve them run over the front surface, partially obstructing the light path and creating a blind spot where the optic nerve exits.
It's a blind spot, right.
A sensible engineer designing an eye from scratch would likely put the wiring behind the photoreceptors. Our brain does an amazing job processing the image and filling in the blind spot so we don't notice it. But the design itself reflects its evolutionary history, modified from simpler structures, not perfectly engineered and new. It's a patched-together solution that works.
And the hiccup, that has to be an imperfection. What's the evolutionary story there?
The hiccup is a fantastic evolutionary relic. It's completely useless to us, often just annoying. It's basically a nerve spasm involving the muscles we use for inhalation, like the diaphragm, and the sudden closing of our glottis, the opening between the vocal cords. That hic sound is the air hitting the closed glottis.
Okay, but why?
Well, the nerve pathways involved originate in the brainstem, controlling basic rhythmic actions like breathing, that's the ancient fish part of our brain. The specific pattern of spasm, the sharp intake of air followed by closing the glottis, is remarkably similar to how amphibians, like tadpoles, breathe. They pump water over their gills using a similar rhythmic muscle action, but they need to close their glottis to prevent water from entering their lungs. So a hiccup seems to be our ancient fish amphibian breathing control system, occasionally misfiring in our modern mammalian bodies. It's a neurological ghost from our aquatic past.
A ghost in the machine. That's hilarious. You also mentioned rudimentary organs versus nascent ones. What's the difference?
Good question. Rudimentary organs are vestiges, leftovers from our ancestors that are now useless or nearly useless. Think of the tiny, functionless hip bones buried inside the body of a whale, remnants of the legs their land-dwelling ancestors had. Or the human appendix, largely useless for us, maybe even problematic, but derived from a larger digestive pouch in our herbivorous ancestors. These are evolutionary leftovers.
Okay. And nascent.
Nascent organs are structures that are currently useful, but perhaps still being modified or adapted for a new or refined function, maybe a penguin's wing. It's no longer used for flight, but it's been highly modified by selection into a powerful, efficient flipper for swimming. It's an organ in transition, adapted for a new purpose. These different states, rudimentary, nascent, fully adapted, show evolution as an ongoing process of modification. And this history isn't just in big structures, it's even reflected in our senses, like smell.
How so? How does smell show evolution?
If you look at the genes responsible for detecting odors, the olfactory receptor genes, you see a clear pattern across vertebrate evolution. Primitive fish, like lampreys, have very few of these genes. As you move to bony fish, then amphibians, reptiles, the number increases. But when you get to mammals, there's an explosion. We have hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 functional odor genes, plus many non-functional pseudogenes that were likely active in our ancestors.
So mammals invested heavily in smell.
It seems so. This huge number of genes allows for detecting a much wider range and finer nuances of smells, which makes sense for animals that often rely heavily on smell for finding food, avoiding predators, finding mates, or recognizing kin. Think of a bloodhound tracking a scent. This expansion of the olfactory toolkit is another clear evolutionary trend reflecting adaptation to different sensory worlds.
Okay, so we've seen the history in fossils, anatomy, embryos, even genes. But is this stuff still happening? Is evolution observable now? Or did it all happen millions of years ago?
That's a key question, and the answer is a resounding yes. Evolution is absolutely still happening. The processes Darwin described, variation, inheritance, selection, are constantly at work. And sometimes we can even watch it happen in real time, or at least over observable timescales. John Endler's work with guppies is a classic example.
Ah, yes, the Trinidadian guppies. Tell us about that. How did it show evolution in action?
Endler studied wild guppies in streams in Trinidad. He noticed that in some streams, the male guppies were incredibly bright and colorful, almost like the ones you see in pet stores. In other streams, often just slightly upstream or downstream, the males were much drabber, more camouflaged.
Why the difference?
He figured out it was related to predators. The streams with the drab males had lots of dangerous visually hunting fish like pike cichlids. The streams with the flashy males had fewer predators or only less dangerous ones. So there was this trade-off. Female guppies prefer bright males for mating.
Sexual selection again?
Exactly. But being bright makes you much more visible to predators. So, where predation was high, natural selection favored drabber, camouflaged males. Where predation was low, sexual selection could run wild, leading to brighter males. It was a balance.
Okay, that makes sense. But how did he show it was evolution happening now?
That was the elegant part. He did experiments. He moved guppies from high predation areas to low predation areas, protected ponds or streams, without the nasty predators. And within just a few generations, like 10 or 15, which is only a couple of years for guppies, the males in the low predation environments evolved to be significantly brighter and have larger spots. He also did the reverse, introducing predators, and saw the guppies evolve to become drabber.
Wow, that quickly.
Yeah, it showed just how fast natural selection can act when the pressure is strong. It was direct, observable evolution driven by a change in the environment. A beautiful demonstration.
That really brings it home. Beyond experiments like that, what about the big picture, the way life is spread across the globe? Does that pattern also support evolution?
Immensely so. Biogeography, the study of species distribution, provides huge evidence. Take oceanic islands, like the Galapagos, Darwin's famous laboratory. These islands were formed by volcanoes, never connected to the mainland, so any life there had to arrive from somewhere else, probably mainland South America in this case, across hundreds of miles of ocean.
A tough journey.
Very tough. Probably rare colonization events, maybe birds blown off course, reptiles rafting on vegetation. But once a few colonists arrived, they found new environments, different food sources, no competitors initially, and they diversified. The ancestral finch that arrived diversified into over a dozen distinct species, each with a beak adapted for a specific food, seeds, insects, cactus flowers. Different species even evolved on different islands within the archipelago. This pattern of unique island life, clearly related to mainland forms but distinct, is exactly what you'd expect from evolution and diversification in isolation.
Makes sense. And you mentioned earlier that continental drift, something Darwin didn't know about, adds another layer to this.
Oh, massively. Plate tectonics revolutionized our understanding of biogeography. Before we knew continents moved, people had to invent hypothetical land bridges, now sunk beneath the waves, to explain why, say, South America and Africa have similar fossils or related living species.
Right.
But now we know these continents were once joined together in the supercontinent Gondwana, along with Antarctica, India, Australia, and Madagascar. As Gondwana broke apart and the continents drifted over millions of years, they carried their cargo of life with them. This explains the deep historical connections we see in the distribution of many plant and animal groups across these now widely separated land masses, far better than any imaginary land bridge ever could. It provides the deep time context for evolutionary diversification on a global scale. Darwin would have loved it. And finally, let's circle right back to the very beginning, to that idea of universal common ancestry, the banana cousin thing. There's that one piece of molecular evidence that ties it all together.
The universal genetic code, the shared language.
Exactly. The fact that the dictionary translating DNA sequences into amino acids to build proteins, is essentially identical across all known life, from bacteria to blue whales to us, is just staggering evidence for a single origin. There are a few tiny variations in mitochondria or some microbes, but they're clearly minor tweaks of the standard code, not completely different languages.
So if life had started multiple times independently, we'd expect different codes.
You absolutely would. Different ways of encoding information, maybe even different sets of amino acids. The fact that it's fundamentally the same code everywhere is the ultimate smoking gun for a single common ancestor from which all life on Earth descended. It's arguably the most profound evidence for the unity of life.
It really is. Okay, so summing all this up. Fossils, anatomy, embryos, genes, modern observations, biogeography, the code itself. The evidence seems overwhelming, yet you still hear people dismissing evolution as just a theory. How should we understand that word theory in a scientific context?
That's such an important point of confusion. In everyday language, theory often means a guess, a hunch, something uncertain. Oh, that's just your theory. But in science, a theory is the complete opposite. It's a well-substantiated, comprehensive explanation for a whole range of phenomena, built on a vast body of confirmed facts, observations, and experiments.
Like the theory of gravity.
Exactly. Or the germ theory of disease, or the theory of plate tectonics. These aren't wild guesses. They are robust, evidence-based frameworks that explain how the world works. Evolution is a scientific theory in that sense. The fact that life has evolved is supported by overwhelming evidence. It's beyond reasonable doubt, as Richard Dawkins puts it. The theory of evolution explains the mechanisms, how it happens, primarily through natural selection, but also incorporating other factors like genetic drift, mutation, etc.
So the fact of evolution is established, and the theory explains the fact.
Precisely. And the scientific consensus on the fact of evolution is virtually universal. Polls consistently show near total agreement among scientists worldwide, especially biologists. Importantly, this acceptance extends beyond science, too. Many educated religious leaders, theologians, the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, they've all indicated that the scientific fact of evolution doesn't conflict with their core faith, though interpretations may differ. They accept the evidence because it's scientifically undeniable. So dismissing evolution as just a theory really misunderstands what science is and ignores one of the most powerful and well-supported ideas in human history. #outro.
Wow. Okay, that has been quite the journey. From Darwin watching finches and thinking about the struggle for life, to Dawkins taking us down to the level of the selfish gene.
To Shubin finding Tiktaalik up in the Arctic.
And Coyne laying out all the evidence from anatomy and development. It really feels like we've seen how this incredible story of life gets pieced together, refined, understood more deeply over time.
It really is a testament to scientific inquiry, isn't it? Observation, prediction, testing. It shows how connected everything is, this deep unity of life, but also how dynamic and constantly changing the natural world is. Evolution isn't just something that happened, it's happening right now.
And that, I think, is the thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. The next time you see a bird, or maybe just look down at your own hand, take a second. Think about the immense history packed into that form, the billions of years, the countless tiny changes, the survival challenges met. Nature itself is always doing this deep dive, constantly tinkering, constantly adapting. What adaptations, what little evolutionary stories might you notice in the world around you now? Looking through this lens, keep asking questions, stay curious. And if this deep dive sparked your curiosity, please do consider subscribing to our channel, Whispers of Wisdom, so you can join us for future explorations like this one.
Yeah, your support really does help us keep these conversations going.
It absolutely does. It helps cover the costs of the tech and the time it takes to put these together. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.